Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 16th of July. As you know, in our last class, we reviewed the syllabus and the course outline. So if you've got any questions about that, please reach out to me. And I had indicated that what I wanted to do today was to talk briefly about plagiarism and artificial intelligence, which I did not get a chance to talk about last class, and then to begin talking about some of the content for the course. As you know, I've put most of the course readings up front so that we could utilize that information to help us prepare for our first speech, actually, for all of our speeches. And I'm well aware that this is still very early in the semester, so you may not necessarily have access to the textbook. I found out that the library did not have a copy on reserve, so I have ordered one from the publisher. And in the interim, these class videos basically serve as summaries, if you will, of some of the important classroom material that will be addressed in the textbook readings. So hopefully all of those pieces together will be useful to you as you begin contemplating how to put together speeches. But as you know, I had skipped the plagiarism and artificial intelligence section, so I wanted to speak briefly about that before I started to get into some of the other pieces. And basically, plagiarism is using somebody else's language or ideas without acknowledging the source. So the key is to make sure that you're giving credit. And I used to give examples of people who plagiarized, and one of those examples was from very early on in my career, pre-internet no less, when a student submitted in something that sounded familiar, and I obviously couldn't turn to the internet because it didn't exist in the form that we know of it today. I had to rely on my own memory. It wasn't too difficult to figure out where the student had plagiarized from because basically the student had just lifted passages from our class textbook with a few mechanical errors. Not sure if the student was trying to deceive me or whether or not the student was just a sloppy plagiarist. And the better story, which did not occur to me but happened around the same time, and it was in all the academic newspapers. Yes, there are such things as academic newspapers. A middle aged professor, that part is important, is reading a set of papers, realizes something sounds familiar. Again, can't turn to the internet, so he has to rely on his memory. And he realizes as he begins to contemplate, this wasn't something that he had read before. It was something that he himself had written years earlier as an undergraduate student. This is one of his old papers. And I know the chances of such a thing happening, they seem remarkably slim, but in this instance, it actually occurred. Had something to do with a fraternity that was recycling old papers. So, nevertheless, those were my two stories about plagiarism. But obviously, we are in a brave new world when it comes to artificial intelligence. And I just wanted to read to you what I wrote about artificial intelligence in our syllabus. And I had indicated that you should think of AI as a kind of professional tutor, at least in this particular class. Nothing more, nothing less. AI can either be used or abused, helpful or harmful, correct or incorrect, and or efficient or inefficient. And again, for this course, which emphasizes critical thinking and learning, please use your natural intelligence instead of artificial intelligence. I have to admit, I'm a bit skeptical about artificial intelligence for a whole host of reasons. I know that the information is not always accurate. I know that artificial intelligence sometimes actually does something called hallucinate. So it creates information that is basically fictional. I certainly know that artificial intelligence uses an incredible amount of resources, water and electricity in particular. I certainly have some ethical questions about the way artificial intelligence was initially programmed through the work of humans who are not receiving credit, their art, their music, their literature. And I suppose if you are a science fiction fan, then you know about some of the questions associated with artificial intelligence or any kind of technology or creation that is no longer able to be controlled. So I put all of those together, and I personally avoid artificial intelligence, though I understand it's already embedded in so many of our computer programs that it's impossible to avoid. But if the purpose of this class is to help you improve your speaking skills and to help you improve your thinking skills and to help you to improve your organizational skills, then I think you really are better off doing it on your own. And I understand the temptation for artificial intelligence that you want to get a good grade. And I have deliberately tried to construct this class, all of my classes, in fact, so that no one assignment can make or break you, and that ultimately effort is rewarded as much as product. So I hope all of this encourages you to rely on your natural intelligence, which I still believe is superior to artificial intelligence. So that was my little soapbox speech about artificial intelligence. And you can see that what I did today was I had assigned several chapters quite optimistically. I understand you may not have access to the textbook yet. However, these videos will be covering the major points from the textbook. And I did learn that the GCC library is going to get a copy of the textbook to put on reserve. They don't yet have one. So hopefully that will be occurring soon. But I'm also aware that because people are still adding and dropping and getting textbooks and so forth, you may not necessarily have done the reading for this class or this class that I had scheduled for today. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted you to watch a video by Toastmasters. And Toastmasters is an international organization that is devoted to helping individuals improve their public speaking skills. It's in a non academic format, and it is international. In fact, if you look at the notes below, you can see that I have included a link for Toastmasters if you wanted to learn a little bit more about this organization. They came out with a video a while back, so it is a little bit dated, about writing and delivering great speeches, which is 35 minutes long and serves as a kind of overview of some of the major principles that we'll be talking about over the course of the semester. And after you watch this video, you'll see the importance of practicing. After they mention over and over again, that really is the way to improve your speaking skills. And the importance of preparation. Thinking about things like logistics, where you are going to be delivering information, who your audience is, what your objective is. Do you need to do research? And thinking about a speech in some ways like a paper that has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, though they reference it as an introduction, discussion, and conclusion, where the introduction is where you state your thesis, your main point, and it's also where you greet your audience. And your discussion section is where you give your evidence and your details. And then finally, your conclusion, which is where you give a sense of closure and you say farewell to your audience. And some of the points that they emphasize that we will be discussing is the importance of being conversational. And there are lots of different kinds of speeches you can deliver, but we are delivering the kind of speech where you've got notes to help give you guidance, but ultimately what you want to do is to have a sense of connection with your audience. So you want it to sound like you're having a conversation with them. We'll talk more about that speaking outline, but if you're curious to know what my speaking outlines look like for these videos, all you have to do is look at the notes below the video because those are my outlines. The importance of not just content, but presentation. Things like eye contact, body language, vocal inflections, pausing. So slowing down and pausing for dramatic effect. And trying to anticipate and address audience questions, especially in this format, because you're not presenting to a live audience. Obviously, you are presenting electronically. So, as many questions that you can try to think of that you can address in your speech, the less likely it is that the viewer of your speech would be confused by what it is you're going to be saying. As you know, your first speech is an autobiographical speech, 5 minutes. And we will be talking about that over the next few classes. And the goal for you is to introduce yourself to your audience, which is what you did in your discussion forum question, but you would do it obviously in oral form, and you would have approximately 5 minutes to do that. And the timing is always challenging because you want to try to get as close as possible to the timing. But certainly, it's not as if you've got a stopwatch in front of you, but you want to avoid extremes. So if you've got a 5 minute speech, you don't want to go over by 5 minutes, obviously. If you have an hour speech, and you went over 5 minutes, well, that would be fine because that really wouldn't be very much. So, a lot of it is commonsensical when you think about it. And you can begin thinking now about what exactly it is that you think you might want to share in an autobiographical speech. Do you want to give a kind of life overview where you talk about some of the major points in your life? Do you want to focus on a particular element, a particular time period in your life and do that? Um, Somebody or something that's important in your life could be the focus, but remember that ultimately the focus is on you and not on the other person or the other thing. So the chapters that I had assigned for you to read would hopefully be helpful to you as you are thinking about putting together that first speech. And the first chapter, chapter 1, in the newest edition of the text, but as you know, you can use older editions as well, is the need for public speaking. And that this class is basically a kind of laboratory where you can get practice and get feedback. That's really the way that you should be thinking about it. And that speeches are integrative. In other words, they're shared values that the speaker and the audience share. They are oftentimes redundant. There's going to be a certain level of repetition to speeches that you wouldn't necessarily find in an academic paper because people have very poor listening and memory skills, as we will talk about in future classes. That you're going to be discussing something specific or concrete, and you do need to consider the situation, the time, and the place. And you, as speaker, are the source of the message, and the message is information, but it also includes attitudes, your emotional responses to things. And then there's the listener who receives and interprets the message. And if you were speaking to a live audience, would give sometimes verbal feedback, sometimes nonverbal feedback. And that's probably the biggest challenge with the recorded speech is that you don't have an audience. That said, you will have an audience because you will be recording your speeches, much like this class video is recorded, posting it on Moodle, and I will be putting a folder onto Moodle where you could post your speech, and your classmates will be viewing the speech and then sending me feedback, and then I'm going to compile all that feedback and present it to the class as a whole. So basically, you don't necessarily have that feedback in the moment. Certainly, if you've got family or friends who wanted to listen to you deliver your speech as you are speaking to the camera, that would be perhaps a way to get feedback. But that said, so much of our communications now happen to be electronic and online. I think this is a very useful skill to be able to speak to a camera and to give off a sense of conversationality, much like you would if you were speaking to a live person. And there are oftentimes things called interference, barriers to receiving communications. They can be physical. For instance, somebody might be hard of hearing, or they can be emotional. Again, somebody might not necessarily listen very well because they have, let's say, some sort of a emotional challenge that they're focusing on. It could be intellectual or all of the above. So you want to try to make your speech as accessible as possible for as many audience members as possible. And you do have an advantage because you know who is in your audience, your classmates. Speeches are transactional. I mean, they're occurring basically in a two-way sort of loop, in that there's a speaker who gives a message to an audience, but then the audience responds back, and then the speaker might adjust accordingly, assuming again that they had that kind of feedback from their audience. So their speeches are interactive, speeches are circular rather than linear one-way messaging or relational where you're just getting feedback. And the audience and the speaker are both integral parts of a speech. And I know that students usually focus on the role as a speaker, but your role as an audience member and giving feedback to me to share with your peers is just as important and is just as much a learning exercise, because you will learn not just from delivering your own speeches, but from listening to the speeches of others. So there is a long tradition of public speaking that goes all the way back to the days of Aristotle. And Aristotle had talked about three elements that we consider even today when it comes to public speaking: logos, which is logic; ethos, which is ethics; and pathos, which is emotions. And all three of them are important in terms of putting together a speech. That you want to be logical, you want to be ethical, and you also want to appeal to your audience's emotions. Ethics in particular have become, I think, increasingly important as we've become more polarized as a society and much more divisive as a society. And ethos, which means ethics or credibility, is just good sense, goodwill, good morals. And the idea of being civil in discourse. And I've always said that this is a difficult class to teach, because while we're teaching all of these components, in the real world, we're seeing the exact opposite, where speakers are not being ethical, where they're not being logical, where they don't have goodwill. And I think we should hold those individuals accountable. And because we expect this of ourselves, so we should expect this from others as well, especially individuals who represent us in political realms. So, some of the reasons why we study public speaking: that yes, there is that intellectual imperative to be a well-educated person. You need to know a little bit about rhetoric and public discourse. If you know anything about literature, you know it began in the oral tradition with great epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And luckily for us, all of those were written out so that we can now have access to them in English classes. There is a social imperative because we're all going to interact with one another socially. And the way we do that is orally. So, just in terms of our daily lives, public speaking, whether we do it electronically or we do it in front of a live audience, and it'll probably be a combination of both, is increasingly important. And there is a consumer imperative, that as an audience member, you are consuming the speeches of others. And as I had indicated, we should expect the same level of professionalism from others that we expect from ourselves. So, in terms of the second chapter that I had you read about differing perspectives, and assume that there are going to be lots of different opinions and perspectives in your audience, lots of different worldviews, lots of different beliefs. Diversity is basically just difference. So this is what you're going to find: lots of differences. And we could spend an entire semester talking about culture, which in the largest or broadest definition would be any group membership, because that group membership would tell us a little bit about the beliefs of the members in that group. Thinking something is true or false is a belief. The attitudes of the members in that group. Attitudes are emotions. the values of the people in that group, and this includes things like beliefs and attitudes. That said, we want to avoid stereotypes, overgeneralizations, that not everyone in this group is going to be exactly the same. There is individual difference as well. And keep in mind that all of us have biases. Even AI has been shown to have bias. It's not that surprising considering the fact that AI has been programmed by humans and humans have bias. So the idea is to try to be as self-aware as possible and to be as culturally intelligent as you can be, understanding about different groups, being sensitive to those groups, and being competent in your interactions with those groups. In other words, understanding and adapting to different cultural perspectives. And trying to have empathy and perspective taking as much as possible, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, so to speak. I think that one of the best ways to do that is literary studies. It's one of the reasons why I'm in literary studies, that it gives you the opportunity to experience other perspectives, other viewpoints through characters. And oftentimes, through literary studies, you can learn about people that you would never have the chance to be exposed to in the real world. Also, active listening. As I said, that our goal is not just to present information, but to absorb information and to listen to the speeches of our peers and to provide feedback. And there is a difference between hearing, which is just processing sound, which most people can do, as opposed to listening, which is paying attention. But more on that in the upcoming classes. And then I had assigned one last chapter to talk about what I call the elephant in the room, something the Toastmasters video didn't really talk much about, and that was about speech anxiety. And the reality is that everybody is going to feel a certain level of nervousness. And there could be just a general sense of anxiety that an individual has. That's trait apprehension. But there is also state apprehension, which is based on anxiety because of the situation, such as test taking or, let's say, delivering a speech. There even is a fear of public speaking, glossophobia. So I'm hoping that that's something that we can address in this class. You can't ever completely eliminate anxiety, nor would you want to. It shows that you've got basically some concern about the event, which is good. It can make you perform much better. But you don't want it to get in the way of your actually producing some sort of a final product. So it's about balance. Ways to reduce anxiety. The textbook gives some suggestions, which I'll pick up on next class, but that's going to be your discussion forum question for today. That I'm sure you've had experiences where you've had to deal with anxiety in the past. And my question is, what suggestion or suggestions do you have to try to control or at the very least reduce nervousness? And again, I can't give you a magic bullet here, but my assumption is that we all have techniques that we can share with each other that would be useful for us to consider as we are pulling together our first speech and the subsequent speeches that will follow. So I'm going to leave this here so that you can watch that Toastmasters video, which I highly recommend, 35 minutes. And basically, I would say it gives a good overview about the kinds of things that we will be talking about over the course of the semester. And it will also help prepare you for thinking about things like, well, your first speech and the speeches that follow. And one of the things the Toastmasters video talks about is that there are different kinds of speeches. Some are informative. And in fact, you have a speech that's devoted to just being informative. That's speech number 2. And the importance of being clear and concise in that. Some are persuasive, and you have a speech devoted just to that, persuasive speech, where you need to motivate and appeal to the audience emotions. And some are speeches that are meant to entertain. And while we don't necessarily have that, we have an autobiographical speech that I personally find quite entertaining. I like to learn about my students, and the use of stories and humor is a wonderful way in which to grab your audience's attention. And in some ways, these divisions are rather artificial, because I would say that basically all speeches, even an autobiographical speech, inform and persuade. But the reality is that it's about focus. So the first speech, the autobiographical speech, is a speech for you to get to know your classmates and a speech for you to practice some of the principles of public speaking. But again, as I said, I wanted you to watch the video and also answer the attendance question about what suggestions do you have to control nervousness. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, which will be Tuesday of next week. Take care. Bye-bye.